Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hi guys, original link to the video, top description, below that, Discord, Mark Felton, awesome channel, Mark Felton Productions. Let's learn. America versus Germany. Hope you're all doing well. Phones away.
Most people think that the United States entered World War II on the 7th of December 1941, with the Japanese attack on the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. But few realize that America had already been at war for several months, not in the
I'll
Pacific,
react to that, sure.
but in the Atlantic.
Oh, you will? Sorry guys, that was my other video.
An undeclared war with Nazi Germany despite US neutrality and a policy of isolation. It was a war that led to many American deaths long before Pearl Harbor, but today is virtually unknown. World War II officially began in September 1939 with the German invasion of Poland. This act caused Britain and France, which had an agreement with Poland to help protect it, to declare war on Germany. Germany proceeded to conquer Poland, assisted by the Soviet Union, and after a pause to regroup, in summer 1940, it unleashed a massive force in the.
What was the deal with Poland in between the two world wars? Blows my mind just how seemingly caught off guard everyone was by the Second World War when the First World... I'm sure that might have contributed to the fact that it was so caught by surprise, that it was so close to the previous World War. But I mean, Poland is sitting in between, obviously, the USSR and Germany. It's hard with hindsight to put yourself in the shoes of political leaders of the day, but it just, how was everyone so caught off guard? I don't get it.
West and invaded Norway, Denmark, France, Belgium, Luxembourg and the Netherlands, defeating all of these nations and forcing the British from continental Europe in a humiliating evacuation from the French port of Dunkirk. The new British Prime Minister Winston Churchill had a good working relationship with US President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and it was clear that Britain required help to defeat the Germans, in particular the U-boat threat. Since the German conquest of France, the German Navy had gained a series of U-boat bases on the Atlantic coast. Hitler's intention was to starve Britain into submission by sinking supply ships, bringing food and many other goods from North America to Britain.
Same tactic as against Napoleon, right?
Forcing Britain to the negotiating table.
It's like, I see a lot of parallels between Napoleonic France and Nazi Germany, but maybe I'm not thinking about it enough.
Being an island nation meant being a great mercantile trading nation as well, and the
I don't mean by ideology. I mean by like what happened. And their
destroyed
goals.
or severely interrupted that trade. Britain in
I gotta stop talking.
Nation meant being a great mercantile trading nation as well, and the U-boats destroyed or severely interrupted that trade. Britain in 1940 to 41 was the world's biggest empire with the biggest navy, but its military and naval might were thinly spread all over the world, protecting a myriad of colonies and territories. The U-boat.
You can almost walk from Cape Town to Singapore and stay in British Empire territory the entire time. Obviously, they don't have Iran and they don't have Thailand. So you can't really. But just the fact that it's close, I mean, how many miles is that?
The U-boat campaign was highly successful as the Royal Navy was short of escort vessels to help protect the Atlantic convoys.
We'll help.
Hundreds of ships were sunk, and severe rationing was introduced in Britain as supplies ran short. The American government also saw an opportunity to expand US influence, and in 1940 the Destroyers for Bases Agreement was concluded. In return for 50 old US Navy destroyers, Britain would grant the US...
For a second, I thought that was Prince Philip with FDR, but I'm like, no, he's not that old, and he wouldn't. Never mind.
In return
It doesn't
for
make sense.
50 old US Navy destroyers, Britain would grant the
Never mind.
US leases on a series of British military bases, initially in Bermuda and Newfoundland. Interestingly, many American citizens were already fighting for the British. American volunteers had already seen action fighting the Germans in British uniform. Perhaps the most famous was the Royal Air Force's Eagle Squadron, comprised of US volunteer pilots that fought with distinction in the 1940 Battle of Britain. In London, there was even a Home Guard unit made up entirely of American residents, the 1st American Squadron.
I never heard of that.
In March 1941, President Roosevelt signed the Lend-Lease Act. The act permitted the US to supply Britain with food, military aid, and so on, eventually amounting to some $31 billion. Many other Allied countries also benefited substantially from this aid. Roosevelt ordered US troops overseas to occupy and protect the bases acquired from Britain that included, as well as those in Bermuda and Newfoundland, bases in St. Lucia, the Bahamas, Jamaica, Antigua, Trinidad, and British Guiana, now Guyana. But Roosevelt determined to move US military forces into the war zone between Britain and Germany as well.
So there was a British Guiana along with a French Guiana? I'd imagine that was a very important place for the triangle trade back in the day, because isn't that in order to get from the UK or like the old world to the new world before engines and propellers? It was actually faster to go, like if you wanted to go from Ireland to New England, say you want to go from London to New York, it would actually be faster to go down by Spain, by Africa, and then over along North America, the northern part of South America, and then up. And so I'm just wondering why there's a French and British Guiana side by side right at that point in South America.
In March 1941, Churchill agreed to permit the US use of naval bases in Northern Ireland. Churchill, who desperately wanted the US to enter the war on Britain's side, knew that if it did, America would require adequate air and sea bases from which to begin immediate operations against Germany. On the 19th of May 1941, the US Army Special Observer Group was activated in London, tasked with finding locations for future US AAF air bases and US Army camps across the UK. It was commanded by Major General James Cheney. In June 1941, in great secrecy, the first US troops actually arrived in the UK, 362 technicians as they were described. By October 1941, over 1,000 US Corps of Engineers personnel were busy building bases in Northern Ireland, and they were completed by December 1941 in time for America's entry into the war. Greenland, lying close to Canada, was and still is a Danish territory. With the German occupation of Denmark in April 1940, the US government realized that Greenland could also be occupied by the Germans. U-boat bases in southern Greenland would have cut the transatlantic convoys to Britain, so Roosevelt ordered.
And say that Germany defeated, say the Battle of Britain went a different way and the British Air Force was defeated and the German Air Force had total air superiority and eventually would demand surrender, right? And then America would have to be worried about Germany interfering with them. But then Germany would have its hands full with keeping Europe under control, and they'd have to deal with the Soviet Union. So I'm just wondering, would Greenland be like, oh God, they could use Greenland as a way to invade Upper Canada and then reach the U.S., but maybe I'm just going too far ahead of myself.
US forces to occupy Greenland and deny it to the Germans. The US did this also to stop Britain or Canada from occupying the territory, and they were very interested in protecting the cryolite mine at Iviktut, cryolite being a vital component in the manufacture of aluminium, or as the Americans say, aluminum. In the event,
Guys, they're spelt different. They're not just pronounced different. They're alumina. It's not like we.
the US didn't send armed forces to occupy Greenland, as that would be seen as too provocative, as the US was supposed to be neutral. Instead, US Coast Guard vessels landed armed Coast Guardsmen to take control of the mine. 3-inch naval guns were also
How is that different?
dug in ashore. In this manner, Greenland retained some sovereignty, but received US protection in return. Later, in 1941, Greenland became an important way station for Lend-Lease aircraft being sent to Britain, and on the first anniversary of the German occupation of Denmark, an agreement was reached that basically turned Greenland into a de facto US protectorate. Interestingly, the US forces have never left. They remain.
That seems so weird. It sounded like it was set like they wouldn't want to land troops and make it seem like they were in the war now, and so they landed troops. That didn't.
In Greenland today, operating Thule Air Force Base, 1,000 miles from the North Pole. Another Danish possession also ended up being occupied by the US, Iceland.
Iceland was Danish too, huh?
The island declared independence from Denmark when the mother country was overrun by the Germans, and Britain was worried that Germany might establish U-boat and air bases upon it. The British invaded and occupied Iceland on the
Yeah, Iceland starts to become real important. Okay.
10th of May
If
1940,
stuff goes
meeting no resistance. The
Germany's
British
way.
Royal Marines were in turn relieved by a Canadian infantry brigade, but Canada was in the process of shipping her forces to the UK, so FDR stepped in July 1941, sending US Marines to Iceland to take over some of the garrison duties. The hastily assembled 1st Provisional Marine Brigade was sent from Charleston, South Carolina to Iceland with 4,095 Marines. Eventually, the entire 1st Marine Division, 28,000 men strong, would occupy Iceland. After Pearl Harbor, this division saw combat against the Japanese at Guadalcanal and Guam. Interestingly, whilst in Iceland, the US Marines wore the shoulder insignia the British 49th West Riding Infantry Division, which had been part of the original occupation force. Appropriately, the symbol was a polar bear. Soon, however, open hostilities broke out between.
So were those supposed to be numbers, but like to made look like polar bear scratch marks?
Between neutral US forces and the Germans. However, open hostilities broke out between neutral US forces and the Germans. In July 1941, in a top-secret memo from Roosevelt to Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of U.S. Naval Operations, the President ordered the Navy to change from a defensive to an offensive stance in the Atlantic.
How have I never heard of him, and he has such an important role? That's
Harold Stark, Chief of U.S. Naval Operations. The President ordered the
That's slightly embarrassing for me.
Navy to change from a defensive to an offensive stance in the Atlantic. Any German U-boat or surface raider threatening U.S. lines of communication, including the Atlantic convoys, was to be, in the words of Roosevelt, eliminated. This plan was codenamed Operational Plan 741, and it would soon result in open fighting. On the 4th of September 1941, the destroyer USS Greer was targeted by the German U-boat U-652 off.
So in the movie Das Boot, is this like the people that the submarine are fighting against, like these Americans and British,
Iceland?
Right?
A British aircraft had warned the Greer that a U-boat was in the vicinity. The Greer made sonar contact and went after U-652. The British aircraft dropped 4 depth charges near the
terrifying.
submerged U-boat, and in response, U-652 fired a torpedo at the Greer, the U-boat's captain perhaps believing that the American destroyer was the one that had dropped the depth charges. The Greer avoided the German torpedo. Following Roosevelt's secret order, the Greer now set about to eliminate U-652. hunting her for 2 hours and dropping 19 depth charges on sonar contact.
Guys, hold on. Okay, guys, is this how a depth charge works? So, okay, you have the water, okay, and then you have, I'll do the submarine in red, and you have a submarine, but this is going to be like the front of the submarine, all right? So it's like this, all right? So I'm looking at it right here. It is like dead to the front, okay? Just so I can, so you drop the, come on, get out of here. So you drop the depth charge, right? So that's the submarine. You drop the depth charge, and so when the depth charge goes in, it doesn't have to hit it. It just has to explode, right? And then that I think like creates a vacuum, like a, hold on. So then that creates like a gap in all of the water, right? Because of the explosion, and then it all has to go fill it in, and so that like sucks out a part of the submarine. I don't know. How does the depth charge work? I don't get it. Okay, continue.
U-652 fired another torpedo at the Greer, which missed, and the action was broken off. The incident was widely reported. Hours and dropping 19 depth charges on sonar contacts. U-652 fired another torpedo at the Greer, which missed, and the action was broken off. The incident was widely reported, and Roosevelt used the action to try and convince the American people to go to war. He also directly warned Germany and Italy that Axis vessels entering into areas protected by the US risked destruction. Admiral Ernest J. King, commanding the Atlantic Fleet, now ordered the Atlantic Fleet to start escorting convoys from Halifax, Nova Scotia, in Canada to Britain. King himself was spoiling for a fight. He hoped that the fleet would be able to tangle with the German battleship Tirpitz, which was also involved in anti-commerce raiding. Remember, this was all 3 months before the US entered World War II. On the 15th of October 1941, the US Navy suffered its first casualties in the undeclared war against Germany. The destroyer USS Kearney was docked in Reykjavik, Iceland, when a wolf pack of German U-boats attacked a British convoy off the coast, the Canadian escort vessels being overwhelmed by the sheer number of U-boats involved. A flotilla of 4 US destroyers sallied forth from Reykjavik to assist.
Whoa.
Flotilla of 4 US destroyers sallied forth from Reykjavik to assist.
Look at that ice.
The Kearney began...
Like, that's no issue? Huh. So, like, I wonder if it takes long to melt when it goes back underwater.
Depth-charging U-boats right through the night. On the 17th of October, the Germans took their revenge. U-568 slamming a torpedo into Kearney, striking starboard amidships. 11 US sailors were killed and 22 injured, but the crew managed to save the ship, which limped to Iceland for temporary repairs. U-568 was chased off from finishing off the Kearney by the Royal Canadian Navy corvette Pictou. Thereafter, the US Navy went gunning for trouble, sending Task Force 1-4 from Halifax to the Persian Gulf. It consisted of the aircraft carrier USS Yorktown, the battleship USS New Mexico, and the light cruisers Savannah and Philadelphia, and 9 destroyers. It was used to escort a British convoy, but Admiral King hoped to be able to take on a German surface raider force, even the Tirpitz. The convoy and the task force arrived safely without any incidents, but it demonstrated a US resolve to fight Germany. Worse was to come for the US Navy, when the Germans managed to sink one of its destroyers off Iceland. The USS Reuben James was based in Iceland, part of an escort group that brought convoys from Halifax to Reykjavik. At dawn on the 31st of October 1941, the Reuben James and 4 other destroyers was escorting a convoy when the U-boat Ace, Kapitän-Leutnant Erik Topp, commanding U-552, attacked. Topp had received the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest gallantry and meritorious service award, in June, after war patrols resulting in his sinking 16 Allied ships.
Pretty impressive. Jeez.
Reuben James was struck by a torpedo actually meant for a nearby British merchant ship. The torpedo detonated in a forward magazine, blowing the bows off the American destroyer. Out of 144 men aboard, only 44 survived the explosion and resultant sinking. Roosevelt was able to use the loss of the Reuben James to further erode support for isolationism and neutrality. However, he and the Navy...
I always wonder, like, if, the U.S. always wanted to kind of stay out of European affairs in the early 1900s. And, World War II comes along, and then, or World War I comes along, and then World War I comes along, and then they're still isolationist, or we are still isolationist. And then we're dragged in to World War II. But how much were we dragged in, and how much was kind of intentional? Not intentional, like, to get stuff sunk, but to kind of, like, push the... I just wonder how the attitude towards war in FDR's mind evolved over time.
Conveniently left out some important details concerning the sinking, including the fact that the Reuben James had not been flying a U.S. ensign to clearly show her neutral nationality at the time she was sunk, nor the fact that she had been depth charging a different U-boat when she was torpedoed by Topp. However, just 5 weeks later, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing the U.S. into World War II, but only against the Japanese Empire. In a moment of staggering stupidity, Adolf Hitler actually declared war on the United States on the 11th of December 1941, saving President Roosevelt the trouble of having to convince Congress and the American people that war against...
I was just about to wonder, I'm like, is that really stupid if they were clearly fighting with the U.S. already in the Atlantic? But that's true. That shows he probably didn't know much about America political decisions and related to how much, the feeling of the American people. But yeah, he saved FDR that trouble.
Germany was necessary. Later that same day, President Roosevelt declared war on...
I feel like I'm pausing at terrible times. This video.
Roosevelt the trouble of having to convince Congress and the American people that war against Germany was necessary. Later that same day, President Roosevelt declared war on Germany. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share. Visit my audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box below.
Just such a class act of a channel. So great. I even see him on, I've seen him on, history documentaries. So it's like Mark Felton. And clearly a very professional guy and great channel. Hope you guys enjoyed that and learned something or can teach me something like you always do down in the comments. And we will continue learning in the next video that I watch a few more history stuff, mainly from recommendations on the Discord. So if you like that, go over there. Also, if you like Minecraft, the info is over on the Discord. I'm going to go back kind of into gaming stuff, and I think that would be the greatest kind of foot in the door game to do just because it's more chill and I can just kind of talk while doing nothing. But we'd love to have you there if that's your thing, and I'll see you guys next video. Bye, guys.